pew, 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 wow. Oh, hey, welcome back to the basement. That is my living room. Today we're gonna look at something that's a little different than normal. It actually, believe it or not, looks like a thing, like a finished thing. It's not all duct tape and stuff. I've been loving, obviously, the emulation experience, and I use my little Batocera laptop and controllers a lot, but there's often it's just missing something that an arcade cabinet has that you don't get kind of like laying in a chair with a gamepad. And so that thing that you're missing in part is big, super loud, clicky buttons. And another thing that's missing is, you know, sitting close to a screen is nice. Granted, this screen isn't huge, but there's just something about the sound and feel of buttons like this and being right here. And so I always wanted an arcade cabinet, but where do you put something that huge? I do not have room for something like that. And I don't know that I would ever play it enough to really warrant taking up that kind of space. So I always wanted like a portable version, something I could take places and it would just be a lot easier to pack up and store. So this is that. This is just upcycled out of a bunch of old garbage, as per usual. This is an old desktop computer that someone had given me and an old, I guess you'd call it, luggage. And so I figured I would show you how I made this. I'm not actually gonna get into the specifics of like how exactly I did the construction on it, because I don't consider myself, like, I'm not good at woodwork, for example. So I don't think you would want to actually take my advice on how exactly I built this. If you've seen my acrylic cuts that are luckily all covered up here, you would not want my advice on this kind of stuff, but we can at least talk about what my mindset was, and hopefully it'll kind of inspire you to do it yourself and maybe even do a better job. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we should probably do is turn it on. So I broke out the LEDs and the power that would usually be on the front of your computer, and I just installed them here. They need to be glued in place, but I'm not sure if this is exactly where I want to keep it, so they're a little bit loose now. As you would expect, this is just a regular desktop PC built in. The boot time's not great. I'm not using an SSD for this, so we will have to wait a second, but you would usually just keep it on anyway, so it's no big deal. This is typical Batocera. I think I'm using a different theme than what comes default. And I do have all the videos and graphics and stuff downloaded, so all the menus are set up like you would expect. As you can see, the joystick feels really nice. The buttons feel really good too. So if we come down here and play a game real quick. This is the shareware version of Doom that comes pre-installed with Batocera. So I have select, start, BAXY, L1, R1, L2, X2 mapped to all the keys. And I do have the volume turned on a lot right now, just so it's not annoying for this video. It runs good though. We're generally playing old stuff on a pretty good computer, so no surprise there. Doom will run on a toaster nowadays, so not much of a stress test, but yeah, it's awesome. It works exactly like you would expect it to for a emulation machine. So I'll quit back out to the menu. Some other features you could see here. We have grills to keep small objects from getting into the fans. And this is the 4-port USB hub that was on the front of the machine. Plus it has a line in and line out. So this is convenient if you just want to plug in headphones. Right now the volume is still inside the box, but generally I just leave it at a set volume on the amplifier. And you can just go through the menus to turn the volume up if you want. So that really hasn't been much of an issue. So I guess we should shut it down and I'll show you the insides and we can talk about how to build something like this. Actually, before we take the lid off of this thing and look at the electronics, let's talk about what I should have done before I put this together and what you should do. I should have installed Batocera using my awesome guide on the desktop computer before I put all this stuff together, so I could make sure, number one, does Batocera run nicely? Number two, do the systems run nicely that I actually want to play on this? I will tell you that one of my, I'm going to call it a regret, there's no room in here, so I'd have to just buy another case to do it. But One of my regrets with not testing that is there's no room for a 3D graphics card, and this motherboard does not have any kind of 3D acceleration. So some systems, some newer systems that are all 3D, that's not happening. So test this first. You might find that the computer just doesn't like Linux. You might find that the computer doesn't like some of the emulators you actually want to play. You might have to upgrade it. Once you've done that and everything runs great, turn the computer off, unplug it, and start building your thing. So the first thing I did when I was thinking about putting this together was I just laid the major parts out. So, you know, I put the motherboard in here and I put the power supply in. I found a spot for the hard drive. This case came with these cool dividers. So, you know, I set the dividers up and made sure everything fit. You have to consider also, you know, there's some super long cables like the VGA cable that goes to the monitor. I'm not about to shorten one of those things. That's more wires than I care to deal with. So I needed somewhere to tuck all that cabling in. Figure that out, make sure it will fit in your case. Another big thing to consider is all the stuff you're gonna bolt on to the top acrylic, it's gonna hang out the bottom of the acrylic. So it needs to fit along the empty space, you know, where like your fan and the other stuff isn't. So these are just all things you need to work out before you start spending money on parts and, see that? Okay, ignore that. As far as the holes that I cut in the back of this, I'll show you that later, but they're not impressive. I'm sure you could do a better job than I did. For the acrylic on this thing, this was also an adventure. Acrylic is very temperamental. Everything you do to it makes it want to shatter. I did find that an oscillating multi-tool was by far the easiest way to cut straight lines on this thing. Of course, I used a guide as well. I cut the straight lines out of a big piece of acrylic and used a sander to round them off. And I paid attention in my particular box, there's these angled edges here. And so I had to make sure these were sanded down so that they fit in there. And then I used, obviously, drill bits to cut out the appropriate size holes for all this stuff. The ports for the fans, initially, for some reason, I thought I would be able to use a small drill bit and just drill an array of holes. Yeah, that did not work at all. So then I just cut big openings, which were super ugly. Luckily, the case for the computer had these grills on it. So I used a Dremel to cut these grills out. I filed the edges so they're not sharp and covered them in rubberizing spray paint, which actually gives it a pretty nice texture. They feel nice now. And that saved this because before that, the holes I cut out were just awful. So I'm very thankful for these grills. They worked out nice. So this right here is actually just Suguru that I used to make a faceplate for the 4-port USB hub here. It's a little hokey looking, but it's a lot better than what it looked like before that. So yeah, like I said, I need to figure out something to do with these lights and this switch. I could just super glue these in place, but I don't know if that's exactly where I want to leave those. So I'm just letting them kind of flap in the breeze for the moment. This is something probably everyone watching this video already knows about, which is just your typical arcade joystick setup from China. These are, I think this cost me 25 bucks for this whole setup. So it's just a USB device that goes to one of the USB ports that are built into the motherboard. So, you know, that's pretty straightforward to set up there. So inside you could see that the cable management is obviously gorgeous. Lots of zip ties. It works though, and that's what matters. So the first tricky part here was off of the power supply, there's a lot of 5 volt, 3.3 volt, and 12 volt lines. They're color coded. I would tell you what colors correspond to what voltages, but instead you should take your particular power supply and you should check that yourself just to be safe. But I got lucky here because the amplifier for the speakers, which happened to just be regular desktop speakers taken apart, worked on 12 volts. And the power supply to the LCD controller was also 12 volts. So in that case, all I had to do was take a couple of 12 volt lines that weren't being used off of the power supply and hook them up directly. And so that powers everything in one shot. The joystick is powered over USB, and that's all the peripherals powered from the power supply. So that was actually very easy. We'll get into this LCD display in a second. So like I said, this is the amplifier right here for the speakers. I keep it at a set volume and just leave it on all the time. And I use the menus inside Batocera to turn the volume up and down, which is easy enough. One interesting challenge about having your audio amplifier and all of your audio lines running across all these high-speed electronics is that you get a lot of line noise. So I ended up fixing that with one of these line noise reduction things here. I don't know exactly what they're called, but I'll leave a link to it. So this just killed it in one shot, no problem. Luckily, I could tuck that behind this divider here. So the last thing we'll cover is the screen. This is just an LCD monitor taken out of an old laptop. When you take those out of old laptops, they don't have controllers, so they appear useless. But you can actually get a controller off of eBay for most of the laptop monitors you're going to encounter, like this. So this is actually the controller here, and it's just a VGA cable going into it in this case. You could also get them in HDMI and other things obviously too. This is a 12-volt line that is spliced onto one of the 12-volt lines from the power supply. We do actually have the buttons for it here too, and they're all held on with double-sided tape. So probably the second biggest challenge of building this whole thing, aside from figuring out how to not destroy my acrylic, was how I was going to get the speakers and the screen mounted to this lid right here. And so the solution I ended up coming up with was using M3 screw standoffs, the little brass things that come in the M3 screw kits, to make basically a pole that comes away from the lid, and then use a washer hooked up to the end of it to give me a lip that I can hold the edge of the screen onto. But what that let me do is basically hold the screen in place at 3 points. And I have this lip here that's a little bit flexible, so I can actually get the screen, you know, off of it or slide it back on. It sounds cheesy, but it's actually nice that it's not super positively affixed, because this won't move at all, but I'm not putting too much pressure on the electronics behind the screen. Another key to making this work is the fact that the speakers are held in place, again, using those M3 standoffs, and they overlap the screen a little bit, so the edge of these speakers actually hold the screen in place as well. So it's not really gorgeous or anything, but it's practical. It works really well. Eventually, I would love to have an acrylic panel across the whole front of this too. I think that would give it a nice extra finish. But to be honest, having all this foam on the front here ends up doing me favors in other ways, which I'll show you later. So speaking of this big thick foam, it's useful for more than just hiding stuff. I actually have a spinning hard drive in here, which normally would be a pretty terrible idea considering this thing is banging and clanking when you carry it around. But I surrounded it with this thick foam so that it has kind of an air cushion on all sides, aside from obviously the top, which is open so that we can get some heat dissipation out of there. But yeah, it hasn't killed itself yet, so far I think it's working pretty well. So that's the internals. I'll show you how it packs up. I'll show you the back, and then we could talk about a few final things. One of the things you'll notice is that if I close it, this joystick actually goes into the monitor. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how I can rearrange things to make that work, but then it hit me, this comes off anyways, so I just take it off. You just set it like that, and this foam has a lot of cushion, so it holds it in place. And there's even enough free space in there to pull this power cable out, wrap it up, and set it in there too. So it's completely all encompassed. Now, I'm gonna show you something. Don't judge me, okay? It's beautiful in its own way. That's the back. I know, the multi-tool wasn't real friendly to this material, but it had to be done. We needed air holes, so I mean, this may look pretty sketchy, and I would not disagree with you, but again, it hasn't killed itself, so I'm gonna call it a win. We have some exit holes here for the fan, and this is where we plug it in, and I messed up the dimensions, but I'm just gonna say this is where you switch from 115 to 220. So if you go to Europe, you got quick access. So yeah, I guess we'll call that a happy accident. So let's talk about a few final things with this. So I've already talked about how it would be nice to find some way to get a graphics card in here. The height, I don't think it's ever going to be possible, but if I can maybe find a graphics card that's not very tall and I can just bust off the top of that like outward facing plate, maybe we can make that work. So that's something I'm going to look into. Talked about the acrylic on the front. That would make it look maybe a little bit nicer. I might also redo the foam on the front just to make that look more professional, because right now it is a hot mess, but it works. Some other things I was thinking about doing that would be pretty cool. Some other things that would be really awesome for future improvements. I'm just going to screw this in because it's really ugly without it. Okay, so Batocera actually supports running your own custom scripts when you change systems and games, something like that. So we could actually hook an Arduino up to the USB port on this and just have serial communication between your scripts and the Arduino to run ambient lights in here and maybe some other stuff. I thought about maybe like a RFID reader, so you can have your favorite games on RFID for the kids or something, so that they can just scan it and it starts. But also, knowing when you change systems and games, we can recolor these buttons by surrounding the bottom of them. These are clear, so the bottom shaft, if you surround with LEDs, they'll actually make the tops glow, and I can put a little video in here to show it. It looks amazing. A lot of systems don't use all these buttons, so if we can have a setup like that, when you change systems, it would recolor these buttons to show you which buttons are actually used for, like, you know, Neo Geo only uses 4, Nintendo only uses 4, but some other systems might use all 8. So it would be really cool to have a visual indicator of what the buttons are and not have to just remember that. Because when you're letting guests play a system like this, they're not going to have any idea how this stuff works, and that might get kind of aggravating. Honestly, it really wasn't that hard to build. I would say the most key thing here, aside from having a computer that could run this stuff, is finding a case like this. I don't know what you would call this kind of case, but the dividers built in made just a whole world of difference, keeping everything apart from each other, giving me places to tuck in cables, and holding my acrylic panel off of the bottom. So I would not do this without a case like this, whatever this is. And now that it's built, it's really awesome having the portability of having an arcade machine in a suitcase, basically. You could take it to parties, you can easily just put it in a closet when you're done. So yeah, super, super happy with it. So there's really no reason why you couldn't build something like this too. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.